we're gonna start off, and I'd like to call on Mr. Chris Corwin Kaczynski, who will lay a wreath in the name of the Canadian Navy here in front of the monument to the victims of communism.
Canada's Central and Eastern European communities initiated a protest to draw international attention to the plight of their heritage nations. These nations had suffered 5 years of war, fighting Nazism and communism, followed by close to half a century of subjugation and oppression by the Soviet Union. Our communities invoked a simple and poignant black ribbon to dedicate a day to those whose devotion and conviction, perseverance and sacrifice, courage and heroism furthered the cause of liberty and humanity in the face of the unthinkable, the unimaginable, the unfathomable, and the unforgivable. The Black Ribbon Day became at once a symbol of protest and a symbol of commemoration. It was dedicated to the many millions of victims of the ungodly Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Nazis and the communists. It was dedicated to the Polish officers who were summarily executed in the forests of Katyn, to the victims of the Holodomor, who were forcibly starved to death beside the fertile fields of Ukraine, to the victims of the Holocaust, where men, women, and children alike perished in death camps such as Auschwitz, Belsenbergen, and Theresienstadt. They dedicated this day to the memory of brave Canadian soldiers and sailors who lost their lives with their allies on the beaches of Normandy. They dedicated this day to those who entered the cellars of Moscow's Lubyanka prison, never to return, to the countless victims of the Gulag archipelago, to those who died of deprivation in cattle cars on Siberia's frozen tundra, or were worked to death in slave labor camps. They dedicated this day to the brave citizens of Prague in 1968 and Budapest in 1956, who faced the tanks of Soviet oppressors in their city's ancient and stately avenues and boulevards. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Black Ribbon remained as a symbol, not of protest, but a symbol of remembrance and warning. Today, however, the Black Ribbon Day must again be harnessed as a symbol of protest as we decry the actions of the descendant of Hitler's partner and its deadly aggressions. Our communities object to the invasion of Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. We object to the illegal occupation of Crimea. We object to the Russian interference in Transnistria, the occupation of Ossetia, the occupation of Georgia. And we object to the kidnapping and illegal incarceration of the Estonian police officer Eston Kohver. Today, our communities commemorate the victims of these aggressions. We honor the memory of 272 victims of the Malaysian aircraft shot down by Russia over Ukraine. And we honor those who have lost their lives defending Ukraine so that they are not forgotten. The Central and Eastern European Council, along with its constituent communities, commends the Government of Canada for the implementation of Magnitsky-style sanctions and our nation's continued stalwart support for NATO. We are encouraged by NATO's expanded role and presence in the Baltics, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and in Slovakia. The principles of democracy and justice that have made Canada a great nation are reflected in these actions. The CEEC fully supports the Monument for the Victims of Communism, Canada, a Land of Refuge, initiated by Minister Kenny, in its current form and current location, and will ask for a statement of support for that position from each party to be publicized within our community media. We will ask for federal parties to confirm their stand on support for NATO and Magnitsky legislation, the banning of the swastika and the hammer and sickle for publication in those same media outlets. The symbol of the black ribbon started 30 years ago in Canada as a symbol of protest and commemoration. It is our dearest wish that it becomes solely a symbol of commemoration and guidance for future generations. The ideologies based in despotism that culminated in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact must remain prominently in our memories so that they may never kill again. Thank you.
Yes, your honors and friends, in fact. I would like to welcome you in the heart of the Czech community here at the Masaryktown Park. It is really symbolic that we meet here so close to the statue of crucified again to commemorate the victims of Stalinism and Nazism, to remember that human beings are capable of such monstrosities. By gathering here today, we are spreading the message that we will keep the memory of victims alive and will do everything to prevent the history from repeating itself. I am happy that Canada's Parliament is supporting this effort by establishing this Black Ribbon Day. And on behalf of Czech Republic, you all, including me, we have vivid support. Thank you very much for your attention.
The reminiscent community, the ladies and gentlemen. Although the Hungarian flag is not here yet, but I can assure you that the heart of Hungarians are here with us. I happen to know Gyula and his son Márton personally. Gyula was a relatively influential person in his small town community, as he was a true, just, and righteous human holding a responsible local position. He was clearly against all cruelties and injustice caused by anyone, any groups or ideologies. During the most dreadful times of the Second World War, setting his face against the life-threatening intimidations of the fascists, Gyula decided to give shelter to a Jewish family in his country with cottage, and because it was less salient this way, his 11-year-old son Márton walked regularly to this cottage with a small basket to provide the people in need with food. Only some years passed when Gyula found himself encountered with another totalitarian regime. Although he had not done any unlawful acts, soon he was pronounced the enemy of the communist society, and most of his wealth, including his country cottage I have just mentioned, was socialized by the characterless servers of the communist regime. Márton was elected to be a leader of the regime-critical local literary circle, and consequently, during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, against the communist regime, he became one of the intellectual leaders of the local events. After the revolution, he had after the revolution had been repressed by the great Soviet Red Army, Marton was imprisoned. And after his release, of course, he as his family was continuously handicapped, inhibited and oppressed in many creative ways. We are all aware of the undeniable, shameful and outraged horror of fascism. It was a clear and overt attack against humanity. It attacked brutally all those important values now we believe. The cruelty of communism was more treacherous and sneaky. It was hidden behind rotund half-truths and behind fake and morbid values. There are still millions from the former communist countries who remember the brutal and unmerciful terror of the period known as communism. During these decades, in Central and Eastern Europe and all around the world, millions suffered great losses. Millions were killed, imprisoned, millions had to live suppressed, crippled lives. There are hundreds, thousands of immigrants only here in Canada who were forced to leave their home country, leaving their families and friends behind. I know well, some of them are here with us. The leaders of the communist countries committed all possible sins and crimes against humanity. They shackled their own societies with their own well-organized espionage, fully removing dignity, freedom, honesty, and individuality from them. Well, for us, who have lived through these overt or hidden horrors of the totalitarian regimes, it is also a case for conscience to get the world acquainted with this sad, sorrowful, and shameful part of history. Yes, it is our unavoidable responsibility. Although it seems difficult to learn from the sins and enormities of history as we seem to keep forgetting them, but there is a wise Jewish saying and advice regarding similar occasions: tell your sons and daughters about the horrors of history to draw the right lesson. Yes, we all have to tell our sons and our daughters, and we are obliged to tell the whole world that what was the shameful and what mustn't be repeated in history. Yes, we have to tell our sons and daughters, just as my grandfather Gyula and my father Martin did.
Mr. Marcus Hess, President of the Central and East European Council, distinguished members of the diplomatic corps, members of the federal, provincial governments and municipal government, representatives of the CEE constituent communities, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to participate at this year's Day of Remembrance at the invitation of Marcus Hess for the victims of Nazi and Soviet communist crimes. I am particularly privileged to bring greetings in my capacity as the President of the International Council in Support of Ukraine, whose first two presidents were inmates of the Nazi concentration camps of Auschwitz and Sachsenhausen. And I was honored and privileged to be elected to that office in Kiev on the 23rd of November, 2013, on the very day that the Revolution of Dignity started. As I look at so many close colleagues present here today, such as Joanna Kuras, I don't see Las Levitt, but I see Marcus Hess, I see Chris Corwin-Kuczynski and others, I am reminded of that long road that we traveled together many years ago in Canada to break the chains of communist tyranny and bring liberty to our respective peoples. Over 3 decades ago, we were waging a common, determined struggle against the then Soviet Union as we prepared a joint resolution to the United Nations from the Estonian, the Latvian, the Lithuanian, the Belarusian, and Ukrainian World Congresses. And that document to the United Nations was entitled The Decolonization of the USSR.
As a member of parliament at that time, I was privileged to present that document on November the 23rd, 1978, to the President of the UN General Assembly and all UN members with the assistance of our Canadian UN Embassy, and I must stress, and the unanimous support of all the parties in the House of Commons. Who would have predicted that 13 years later the USSR would cease to exist, the former Soviet republics and Soviet satellites would become independent states and become members of the European Union and NATO, with the exception, obviously, of Belarus and Ukraine? Who would have predicted that after a short span of some 23 years of state independence, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin would hijack Russia's fledgling democracy and unleash a bloody war in the middle of Europe with the intent of renewing the very USSR we worked so hard to destroy? By militarily occupying and annexing 10% of Ukraine's territory after staging local elections under the point of a gun, we were witnessing a familiar scenario reminiscent of Stalin's 1940 annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, as well as Hitler's 1939 dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. On the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, a war is raging again in Europe as it faces a renewed aggression by a controlled fascist regime whose ideology of xenophobia and ethnocentric chauvinism has transformed approximately 80% of its population into brainwashed zombies, no different from those under Nazi Germany. At a meeting this year, I believe it was in May, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, with representatives of Moscow's Jewish community, as a matter of fact, with 3 rabbis sitting in front of him, Putin had the gall and the audacity to mention his admiration for Hitler's propaganda minister Goebbels, because, according to Putin, Goebbels had managed to transform an entire nation into his vision of Germany under the Third Reich. Now, we know what happened to Goebbels and to the Third Reich, and I believe and I am convinced the same thing will happen with Putin and his acolytes. Putin's version of a new Russian world, as he calls it, the Ruski Mir, has redrawn a European border by force, violating 10 international treaties. To date, Putin's seizure of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine has resulted in the death of more than 6,000, with over 20,000 wounded and 1.5 million refugees. There could have been many more victims were it not for the unity of the Ukrainian people, the sheer determination of the soldiers and the brave volunteer brigades that immediately went to the conflict zone and are still there to the present day. Recent Russian military exercises, of which you probably are well aware and have read about it, have targeted the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with Finland and Sweden. Similar exercises and war games in 2009 even had a scenario of defending a Baltic invasion of Belarus, a war with NATO, culminating with a nuclear attack on Warsaw. That is the type of game that was used by the Russian military to blackmail and threaten the West. The second February 2015 Minsk negotiations, in my opinion, are doomed to fail, just like the first negotiations of September 2014, because they are undermined by the absence of serious military partners such as the United Kingdom and the United States, who, by the way, signed the so-called Budapest Accord. They're not sitting at the table of negotiations. It is France and it is Germany who were never involved in that signature. They had guaranteed Ukraine's territorial security under the Budapest Accord when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. We're still waiting for those two guarantors to sit down and negotiate peace and a ceasefire in Ukraine. The ceasefire in the Donbass region is on the verge, in my opinion, of a collapse any day due to escalating violations by Russian troops and their separatist allies, who continue to receive heavy military hardware from Russia, while the OSCE is prevented from carrying out its monitoring mission in the occupied zone. As a matter of fact, a week ago, 4 OSCE vehicles were burned in the city of Donetsk, and the OSCE leader was even considering pulling out of the war zone. That is the reality we are witnessing today. President Obama still refers to the crisis in Ukraine as merely a regional problem and refuses to accept the U.S. Congress's recommendation to supply Ukraine with lethal defensive weapons. The White House still does not consider Russia as posing an existentialist threat to its national security, but rather views it as an expedient ally to help negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. While Russia continues to undermine Ukraine, to divide NATO, and to destabilize the EU, the West is now mistakenly giving greater priority to combating ISIS, thus relegating Russia's war in Ukraine and the long-term threat to Europe to secondary importance. The Russian intelligence service, the FSB, had infiltrated the jihadist Islamists since 1995, when it allowed the Egyptian terrorist Dr. Zawahiri to leave Russia and join bin Laden in Afghanistan to form Al-Qaeda. You probably saw pictures in the cave of Dr. Zawahiri and bin Laden. Zawahiri was in Russia for 7 months before flying directly to Afghanistan. We must also remember that Putin's henchman of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, praised the ISIS terrorist attack in Paris that murdered Jews and the journalists of Charlie Hebdo, and the next day, Putin decorated Kadyrov with a medal. Yet, Russia is still posing at the same time as a peacemaker and has offered to join a coalition with the U.S. to combat ISIS after arming Bashir Assad of Syria with weapons, resulting in the murder of over 300,000 Syrian civilians and creating 4 million refugees, many of whom, as you see every day, are now trying to escape Syria into Europe and destabilizing Europe, which was exactly the aim of Russia. I could mention much more. I could mention the 3 apartment buildings that were blown up by the FSB according to the orders of Putin as an excuse to invade Chechnya. I can mention to you the genocide of the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, where the entire civilian population was massacred. I can talk to you, as was mentioned by Marcus today, about the Malaysian airplane with almost 300 men, women, and children assassinated. By whom? By the pro-Russian separatists. And yet, they're still investigating it despite obvious proof. I can mention the assassination of over 200 journalists in Russia since 1991. I can mention the murder of Politkovska, who actually discovered and had evidence of the destruction of those 3 apartments in Moscow by Putin. I can mention Litvinenko, murdered in London. Berezovsky, supposedly committing suicide in his bathroom. I can mention, and as we all know, Boris Nemtsov, recently assassinated all of this to terrorize the Russian population. Europe is now more preoccupied, unfortunately, with the Greek debt crisis, with the British referendum on EU membership, and the wave of refugees invading its shores. Russia, on the other hand, continues to finance and support and to who other but Bashir al-Assad of Syria, and a wide array of anti-EU and anti-NATO far-right and far-left political parties in France, Austria, Hungary, and Greece. Mademoiselle Le Pen, as you know, received a loan of $95 million for her campaign from a Russian bank. Supposedly a party that may, in the future election, be the leading party in France. Russia continues to spread lies and sophisticated disinformation through such agencies as Russia Today, filtering into the mainstream media in many countries, including Canada, lies and propaganda. And to this day, Rogers Cable continues to have RT part of a package of news that I have bought, and I am forced to listen to that garbage because it is forced on me. Hopefully, the next government will change that reality. Despite the non-lethal assistance and restrictive sanctions on Russia, Ukraine has been left to rely on its own military resources to defend its territory. Peace talks temporarily have provided some time and suspended a direct Russian invasion, which is possible anytime. They can enter Kiev within 3,000 troops in the Donbass area and 10,000 troops in the Transnistria area. They're well equipped to do that. Time is on the side of Ukraine only because this will allow Ukraine to strengthen its armed forces, hold a referendum to join NATO, and seek funds to prevent a financial catastrophe. Otherwise, Russia's continued aggression may well continue because Putin is unpredictable, and it will be stopped only by the number of returning body bags with Russian soldiers, with mass anti-war demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and a continued decline of the Russian economy due mainly to lowering oil prices. The future, as I indicated, is unpredictable. But I personally believe that truth and justice will prevail, and Putin will go like his nemesis Goebbels into the garbage heap of history. We are holding this day of remembrance on the eve of the celebration tomorrow in Kiev of the 24th anniversary of the declaration of Ukraine's independence. Ukrainians all over the world express their gratitude for the support that each one of you, your communities in Canada, and the compatriots in your homelands, and of your governments in Europe have provided to the people of Ukraine in solidarity with their struggle for liberty, for justice, and peace. And I thank you on behalf of my compatriots in Canada and on behalf of my compatriots in Ukraine, as I'm sure Ivan Baker will do the same. Here in Canada, we are also in the midst of a federal election. We are indeed fortunate to live in a country governed by the force of law, not the law of force. Jointly, we represent, and you realize that because I read this, Marcus, in the announcement about today's Remembrance Day. We represent a formidable electoral force of 4 million Canadians. We don't even realize that. 4 million votes. The Canadian government, whatever political party in power, has always played a leading role in defending the human rights and supporting the aspirations for national liberties by the people of Central and Eastern Europe. Be it in Hungary's freedom fighters in 1956, Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring in 1968, Poland's solidarity in the 1980s, or Ukraine's state independence in 1991. Mr. President, I understand that the CEC under your leadership has set a series of specific demands to all the political parties, and there will be probably a questionnaire, as you mentioned. To all the parties that are currently competing in this election, in one particular case, increasing lethal and non-lethal assistance to Ukraine. I can assure you that Vladimir Putin, every day from now until the day of the election, of the vote, will be closely watching this election, believe me. And his FSB agents are all over the place to sow disunity. I am convinced the Canadian government has taken a firm stand in defense of Ukraine's territorial unity, strongly condemning Russian aggression and issuing the most extensive set of sanctions of any Western country. We should make a joint effort, no matter how you vote and for what party you vote. We should make a joint effort of assuring that the party forming the next government will not diminish the extent of that support, and that it will maintain the same level of commitment to Ukraine, to the Central and East European countries, and will adopt all the CEC demands. God bless you all. God bless the communities and the people of Central and Eastern Europe. God bless Canada.
Bring you greetings from our Premier Kathleen Wynne and our entire caucus. Today we're here to commemorate the victims of the Nazi and the Soviet regimes. The August 23rd date that was chosen for Black Ribbon Day was chosen, of course, because this is the day of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a pact that enabled and allowed the trampling on the sovereignty, the human rights of millions, and the killing of millions. You know, when I think of this day, I think of my grandparents, Ivan and Elena, who immigrated to Canada from Eastern Europe. My grandparents were incredibly proud of their heritage, and they ensured that their children, that their grandchildren knew of that heritage and spoke the language, just as so many of you have as well. And they were incredibly proud of that heritage, but they were also some of the proudest Canadians that I know. And they were proud because they came to Canada seeking a better life, and because they came to Canada fleeing the Soviet regime. My grandparents told me many stories about the Soviet regime. They talked to me about the trampling on the sovereignty of so many Eastern European nations whose flags wave here today. They talked about how human rights were violated, how languages were forbidden, how people were killed. My grandmother herself lost 3 of her brothers to the Soviet secret police. And they talked about the Holodomor, and my grandmother herself was a survivor of the Holodomor and spoke about the crime and the tragedy of the Holodomor. What was on the mind of my grandparents when they told me these stories most often was not just remembering these tragic events or these crimes, but what really frustrated them was that these tragedies, these crimes were not acknowledged or remembered. Not only under the Soviet regime, but also around the world. And that is why I believe Black Ribbon Day is so important, because it ensures that we continue to remember and acknowledge the people who are the victims of these great crimes. What bothered my grandparents as well was that when tragedies and crimes are not remembered and acknowledged, they tend to happen again. They are not prevented in the future. My grandmother once said to me about the victims of the Soviet regime, about the Holodomor, she said that it's important that she hoped that the victims of these crimes would not only be remembered, but honored. Honored, she said, means not just remembering or commemorating, but it actually means taking the steps, taking the actions to make sure that those things never happen again. So today, as we stand here today, never has a commemoration like this, never has Black Ribbon Day been more important. One would have thought that that wouldn't be the case, but it is the case because of the events that are currently happening in Eastern Europe that so many of our prior speakers have spoken to so eloquently. Today we see the Putin regime using so many of the same tools that the Soviet Nazi regime used, through propaganda, through misinformation, through convincing the West not to act, not to intervene adequately. So when I stand here today, what I think about is how important this day is, how important it is that we commemorate and acknowledge the victims of these tragedies, but how important it is that we walk away from here today urging our government officials in Canada and around the world to not only remember and acknowledge, but to take the actions that are needed to ensure that what is happening in Eastern Europe, stops and never happens again. So let us do as my grandmother would have asked if she was here. Let us remember the victims, let us commemorate the victims, and let us honor them. Thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Natalia Kusandova, and I am very honored and pleased to be here today on behalf of Patrick Brown, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. And I'm especially pleased to be here today because I myself have Eastern European roots. On one side, my grandparents come from Poland, and from the other side, from Czech Republic and Slovakia. And just like MPP Baker has mentioned earlier, I grew up hearing about stories of oppression under the communist rule and of the atrocities and crimes perpetrated by the regimes. And today, I am happy, after the ceremony, to be flying to Poland to visit my grandmother. And I feel so lucky and privileged to be able to do that, because as you know, not too many decades ago, that would not have been possible. And it is thanks to the bravery and courage of many men and women who have sacrificed their lives to fight against the oppression and tyranny of these regimes that I am able to do that today. And that's why I think Black Ribbon Day has a significant importance, not only to Canadians and Ontarians, but especially of people of my generation and younger generations, to commemorate all victims of communism and of totalitarianist rule, but also to remember and to ensure that these crimes against humanity do not happen again. And on that note, I would like to read the greetings from Patrick Brown. I would like to extend my most heartfelt greetings to all Ontarians, Canadians, and ethnic communities commemorating Black Ribbon Day today. Black Ribbon Day is a time to mourn the victims of communism and National Socialism in Europe, and to honor those who lost their lives under these evil regimes. Today, we also pay tribute to the courageous men and women who fought back against oppression and tyranny. Black Ribbon Day marks the anniversary of the infamous 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which directly led to the occupation of most of Central and Eastern Europe and the senseless slaughter and oppression of millions. As we mark Black Ribbon Day, we should remember that men, women, and children in many parts of the world continue to face violence and repression from totalitarian regimes and dehumanizing ideologies. On this important day, I encourage all Ontarians and Canadians to join in efforts to promote and protect the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, values on which our country is built upon, and ones that make our province thrive and prosper. I commend the Central and Eastern European Council for hosting this commemorative event and representing the interests of 4 million Canadians of Eastern and Central European heritage. Canada became home to hundreds of thousands of refugees from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Russia, and other European countries, fleeing the Nazi and Soviet communist crimes. Millions of Canadians of Eastern and Central European descent, whose families have been directly affected by Nazi and Soviet communist crimes, have made significant cultural, economic, social, and other contributions to Canada and to the province of Ontario. I am very proud of these contributions, exemplifying the very best of the Canadian spirit. On behalf of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, I would like to offer my best wishes to guests and organizers, and I wish you a prosperous year ahead. In solidarity, Patrick Brown.
On one side, I got the black ribbon, and on the other side, I have something that's called Remember Me Not, or Forget Me Not. I'm not Armenian, but the first genocide perpetrated in the 21st century was against the Pontian Greeks, where my family comes from. And then it was the Armenians, one after another. In 1939, August, when Hitler was getting ready for his final solution, he says, who remembers the Armenian genocide? And things happened to the Jews, and things happened to the Eastern Europeans, and to this very day, things continue around the world to happen to different ethnic minorities. Just because they speak a different language, just because they look different, or just because they have a different religion. And it's a real shame what's happening in Eastern Europe. We thought that those lessons of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s were something that we overcame, but it doesn't look like Putin has forgotten, I guess, his mentor and his previous leader, Stalin. And he still continues to this day to perpetrate atrocities towards the people. I'm joining you here today to bring greetings on behalf of City Council, and I'm pleased to recognize the Central and Eastern European Council in organizing the Black Ribbon Day commemoration. On this solemn occasion, we remember those who perished during the Nazi and Soviet regimes. We also pay homage to the victims and express solidarity with the survivors and their descendants. This is the time to remember the lessons of history and uphold the values Canadians hold dear: peace, freedom, democracy, and respect. This was nothing else what happened to your people than a genocide. It was nothing else than a total alienation. And yet you persevered. And yet we're joined here today, shoulder to shoulder, to say never again. But honestly and truly, I say to you that those are not words that we should take lightly. Those are words that we should work for, strive for, and make sure that we accomplish. To Marcus, congratulations on yet another successful event, and I wish you all the best in the future and the years to come as we fight for democracy and freedom, not only in Canada but throughout the world. Thank you for having me.
I'm honored to join with you this morning on behalf of Prime Minister Harper in commemoration of the tens of millions whose lives were taken by Soviet and Nazi totalitarianism, beginning, of course, with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23rd, 1939. The great Czech novelist Milan Kundera wrote that the struggle of remembering against forgetting is the struggle of freedom against tyranny. The struggle of remembering against forgetting is the struggle of freedom against tyranny. And Elie Wiesel, the great writer of the Holocaust, told us that the call to memory, the call of memory, echoes down to us from the very dawn of time, that no commandment figures so frequently in the Bible as the call to Zachor, to memory. It is our duty, he said, to remember the good that we have received and the evil that we have suffered. And so, we join today with thousands across the world to remember, to discharge this sacred obligation of memory, to remember the good we have received in this land of peace and freedom, and the evil that we have suffered, including the some 8 million Canadians who came to this land from countries occupied by communist totalitarian governments. We remember all of those victims whose lives were taken, who were brutally tortured, who lost their families, who lost everything, who continue to bear the scars of these evil ideologies. Ideologies predicated not on the dignity of the human person, but on the unconstrained power of the state. on the perverse utopian ideological notion that the state can somehow perfect human nature and therefore any political means is justified by that end. An ideology, communism, predicated on the denial of the existence of God, and therefore the denial of human dignity created in the image and likeness of God. It is therefore fitting that here at Masaryktown, the Czech and Slovak communities erected this magnificent monument behind me in front of you, Man Crucified Again, which was created by a famous Canadian Slovak sculptor in Winnipeg in the 1980s, who understood the responsibility to remember. When I first saw this monument some 10 years ago, I immediately thought this was something that ought not to be a discrete place of sacred memory for the Czech and Slovak communities or the other Eastern European communities who commemorate Black Ribbon Day, but in fact that we needed a monument of this nature in our nation's capital. And so it was actually this monument which gave birth to the idea of the Canadian National Monument to the Victims of Communism, the cause that has been taken up by the affected communities through Tribute to Liberty. And I'm pleased to reconfirm that Prime Minister Harper's government remains committed to ensuring the erection in our national capital of a national monument to the victims of communism as a sacred place of common memory. And as we remember the victims, as we remember the story of the refugees of communism who came to Canada, the refugees of the Holodomor, of course the refugees of the Shoah, the Holocaust. But as also we recall the Hungarians of 1956, the Czechs of 1968, Czechs and Slovaks of 1968, the Vietnamese Indochinese refugees fleeing communist terror in 1970 to 1983. We should also remember those who continue to languish in concentration camps where their dignity is denied and where sometimes they are executed because they insist on human freedom. People who live in the greatest concentration camp in the world in North Korea. People in Castro's prisons in Cuba. And finally, we remember because here in the democratic West, in Canada and other countries, there were those who refused to acknowledge the crimes of fascism, who refused to acknowledge the crimes of communism, who apologized for them, who said that the Soviet system was simply misunderstood, that it was a noble inspiration of Marxist principles to attain human equality, but was just imperfectly applied. And I, with you, say that it is time, it is well past time, for those in our academy, in our political, media, and academic and opinion elites who covered over the crimes of communism. Those who said, for example, as the Prime Minister of Canada did following the invocation of martial law in Poland, that it was understandable that the Polish government wanted to control the situation. I think it is time that those who made apologies and excuses for the crimes of the communist system be held to account before history and humanity for having made apologies for these terrible crimes. Yes. And that's what this act of memory is all about. So finally, let me say thank you to the Central and Eastern European communities of Canada for your determination never to forget, because actually it was the initiative of Black Ribbon Day here in Canada which spread to Europe that led to the OSCE resolution, the European Parliament resolution, and the recognition of Black Ribbon Day as a day of solemn commemoration throughout the world. So once again, we Canadians were leading, as we will continue to, incidentally, in standing up to Vladimir Putin's policy of aggression in Eastern and Central Europe. Let us recall the sacred memory of all of those whose lives are memorialized in the monument behind us, and let us recommit ourselves to the cause of human freedom. Thank you very much.
Congress couldn't be here with you today. She asked me to say a few words. First of all, on behalf of Canadian Polish Congress, we are happy that this event is organized every year. I personally participated in those events for the past, I don't know how many years, 25 years or 30. Still remember Chris Korwin-Kuczynski at City Hall when we were commemorating those events in front of City Hall. A tribute of liberty. Canadian Polish Congress is very supportive of this initiative, and we contributed, and we also were helping in fundraising efforts. So we congratulate, thank you Jason Kenney, and we congratulate federal government for recognition of our memorizing those events which should be remembered by our children and grandchildren, and this is going to be a symbol for others to follow and to learn history. Thank you so much.
The word Sokol came out from a translation of the Sokol is falcon, for those who don't know what Sokol means. Sokol is a patriotic physical organization guiding its members to physical and mental fitness combined with moral maturity. Sokol ideas are based on principles of freedom, democracy, equality, and justice for all. The idea of democracy and equality are further enhanced by the idea of Sokol brotherhood. These facts and ideas were a problem for all totalitarian regimes throughout the times from World War I to the end of the 1989. Sokol was dissolved several times during that time, and its existence since 1865. During the World War I in the year 1915, members and leaders were jailed. Right after that, President Tomasz Masaryk called Sokol his third army. In World War II, 1939, was Sokol dissolved in Slovakia. In 1940, was Sokol banned in Czech Republic. Officers and members of Sokol organization arrested, in total of 12,000 jailed, 5,000 executed, tortured to death. 93% of leaders never returned, and all assets confiscated. When Czechoslovakia struggled for democracy in 1945 to 1948, time when communists tried to dominate Sokol, physical education and sport, thanks to Sokol they did not succeed, at least for a little while. At the same time, Sokol was preparing for its 11th all-Sokol sled despite the hard times. Following the sled, 12,000 members were arrested, officers expelled, Sokol dissolved again, and all assets confiscated again. At this time, the torch of Sokol freedom and all the moral principles were in hands of members of organization called Sokol Abroad, existing in a free world. In 1968, during the Dubček's Prague Spring was attempted to make revive Sokol. But in 68, totalitarian regime returns on August 21st, 68 with Soviet occupation, tanks and weapons, and this operation lasted until the November 1989, when Velvet Revolution swept throughout Czechoslovakia and Sokol was free again. Let's hope that's going to be forever. Let's promise ourselves that we will always stand on guard for freedom and democracy against the totalitarian regimes, all of them. Thank you, and Nasdaq.
War veteran who was incarcerated by the Nazis and put in a concentration camp. I'm going to get emotional on this one. I'm sorry. I speak to you for his memory because he was never allowed to go back to Poland after the war because he was a proud Pole and believed in democracy. And I speak to you for all those people who cannot stand before you today and speak about freedom and democracy. And that statue in Ottawa will be built. It will be done to honor the memories of my father and your fathers and your grandparents. I thank Minister Kenny for his work on this behalf. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much. You know, normally politicians and people aspiring to be politicians have set pieces. This is from the heart. God bless you.
I'm extremely glad of it. I remember when we in Lithuania began to speak about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1988. It was a teenager then, and it brought us to independence. But now I want to share you a short meditation and an invocation of God's help. Genocides, crimes of communism, Nazi crimes, racist crimes, religious crimes, capitalist crimes. The victims are not only those who suffer from them directly, but also the participants and the whole society in silence. Of course, between the victims and all the others is an impassable chasm, but Lazarus come to heaven, not the rich. Some are judged, others wait for the judgment of God. Monuments are not sufficient, although monument means evaluation. A winning ideology is not necessarily right. We have experienced that. Unfortunately, we are experiencing it now, and God forbid, we will probably have to experience it in the future. But the survivors of ideologies give us hope. Everything passes. Only the Word of God remains forever. So let us be followers of God's Word, His beloved children, trying to atone for the sins of our earthly parents and inviting God to give us strength, wisdom, and hope. God help us.
Sit down, don't go to